Greetings, I'm Caffeine Rage, and welcome back to the Sunday Sampler. This week, well, things are a little bit different this week as, well, it's summertime, and as the temperature rises and the Steam servers burst into flames, it's time for the Steam Summer Sale, and I feel self-important enough to make a list. Because isn't that what YouTube is all about? Cat videos, montages, and top 10 lists? I mean, really? So I guess this could count as 2 of the 3, since this is a montage of gaming videos as well, but semantics. Anyway, this is my, second 10 games under $10 that you should be checking out. This is the Summer 2017 edition. I will leave a card for the 2016 Winter edition, because I'm pretty sure all the games are still under $10 on that one as well. But I didn't want to repeat, so this is 10 other games you should check out. And as per usual, we'll highlight the one review copy in this that I do have in the top. Well, this isn't even a top 10 list. This is just 10 games that I feel comfortable with suggesting. There's obviously going to be games that I've missed. There's going to be games that you think should be in here that aren't. And if you think there are, leave them in the comments below. The order of the list is completely randomized, so let's just pick one out of the hat and let's get going with Besiege. This is an early access sandbox puzzle builder game thingy. It's very hard to describe Besiege just because it is a lot of things to a lot of different people. It can be just a sandbox builder, you know, build a vehicle and have at it. Or it's just, you know, whatever you want it to be. And I will say that Besiege is the one game in this list that is early access. So it's also probably going to be my weakest suggestion, because you should go into early access games with a huge grain of salt and treat them as finished products, even though they are under active development. And this one is clearly still being very actively developed and has a lot of promise on it, but you know, it's still that thing that you want to just keep an eye out on early access games just in general. And well, that's what this really has, is a lot of promise, but it's also a lot of fun already, and it's cheap. This is $4.79 in North American US dollars in the North American area. And well, not a lot to say about this really, just because it's a game that if you like vehicle builders, well, it's great for you. If not, then it's one that you could easily skip. So let's move right along to Deer Scavenger. This is the probably the least graphically appealing game on the list overall. Yes, I'm going weak on the beginning, but that's probably just that's actually just due to the randomization of the list, but this is a very old school looking and feeling game. It reminds me a lot of RPGs from about 1990-ish. It's not exactly the most appealing games graphically, but it is one of the best feeling RPGs that I've played in quite a while. In that it feels a lot like you are trying to survive, that the world is an active component of this game. A lot of survival sandbox games, which this isn't technically a survival sandbox because there is a story, there are set encounters, and it's a single player as well, which survival sandbox tends to focus on multiplayer. But this is, if you're not careful, you are very easily dead in this game. And this also has permadeath, so if you make a mistake, yeah, that's game over and you start again. I know, that may not sound appealing to a lot of people, and it is a very, very tough game. But it's that rewarding feeling of surviving this apocalypse. Well, it is Detroit, so, you know, it could be present day. Who knows? Or I just lost anyone that is just watching this from the Detroit area. And let's see what else. The crafting does make a lot of sense for the most part. There are a few things that is a little bit iffy on the component side of things, just trying to piece together things. A lot of times, some very obvious craftings will be tied behind a skill, which can be a little bit annoying, but it's one of those games that you try a bit, you fail, and you just keep getting better and better and better. And it's just really, really satisfying to survive and feel like you're actually surviving. And Scavenger is only $3.74, so it isn't exactly the biggest of investments as well. So next up on the list is Banished, another game where the focus is more of survival than anything else, and this is also more of an entry level to the town builder genre as well, which is a subsection of the city builder just in the scale of things, and tends to be the town builders are more focused on a survival aspect. And that's what this one is, that your biggest enemy, as a matter of fact your only enemy, is really the weather and some random events that can happen, which can really screw you over, particularly if you don't plan out for any possibility of them. A blight hitting your crops or a tornado wiping out your town center, that sort of thing. I will say that the game is a little bit simplistic for what I would like, mostly due to short supply chains and short production chains, and that there's no real research in building out more tech. You have pretty much access to everything from the very start, and it's most of the difficulty of this game is learning how the game wants you to play it, and it does require a certain style of play, mostly concerning the population, because the way the population works is that it requires housing to for families to grow, and if you don't build your housing right in the correct order and have enough food to supply the houses, because the houses take food from the main stockpile. It's not if you have enough food, you always have enough food. Houses will take a certain amount of food from each type of food when they're first built, and then they're okay for quite a while. And it could lead to a starvation if you overexpand, even though you should technically have enough food. But on the flip side of things, if you're not expanding or do a staged expansion like you should, like the game wants you to, you could have what's essentially a death wave, where your population hits a plateau of age, and you'll have a lot of people die off and within a year or two of one another just due to old age, which could be very frustrating to lose your first few towns to that, just because the game wants you to build a certain way. And if you didn't, well, you're kind of out of luck. I will say that this game does have some great mod support, though, and my main problem with it being a little bit simplistic can be easily changed with the addition of the mod Colonial Charter, which adds a lot of depth to this game. It is probably the reason why you should play it over the base game, to be perfectly honest. Okay, so another technically survival game, I guess, would be Mad Max. I'm going very heavy in survival this year, or this half of year, whatever. Mad Max. Oh, this. Okay, well, first of all, I should say that there were a few recording issues with this game, but that's just purely recording issues. The game runs beautifully otherwise, and is really real optimized. It just, a couple times I had a little bit of an FPS hitch, so. But this game also has a lot of slowdown and slow motion effects, so, it may look like it's doing slow-mo and some odd times, but it just may be my FPS dropping. But I'm not actually sure if it dropped enough that it could be noticeable. But it was just, it's background footage anyway, so, deal with it. Mad Max is a kind of odd game for me to recommend, mostly because I both like it and dislike it for some very strong reasons. If you're looking for a very story-heavy game, or a game that captures the Mad Max feel, you may want to skip this game, because this game is very, very grindy and very repetitive. This game does its best if you play it in small chunks, a few hours every so often. Mostly due to the fact that it requires, well, there's a large lull in the main story where it forces you to go do other things and forces you to go do side objectives. And this game has a lot of side objectives and a lot of areas to clear. So due to that huge lull in the main story, or at least the lull I hit, maybe it just was the way I was playing and I wasn't doing enough side objectives, and it caused me to have this huge gap in between, I would say, like the first half and the last third, because there was a section where I would get a story mission, then there would be no more story missions for a while, then there'll be another one, and then I'd do more for a while. So it wasn't exactly half and half, but not quite 2/3 and a third. But because of that, it's a little tough to recommend for someone that wants to go into this game and play it straight through. And also, it has some really, really good combat, both on the ground and vehicular. Although the game does tend to focus on the ground combat a lot more than vehicular combat. Once you take out some of the convoys, which aren't actually in the background footage, just because they don't respawn. So once you take out one, it's gone. There's only a set number of convoys. And the convoys are the biggest focus of vehicular combat. Once those are gone, you'll get a few just little skirmishes between a couple of vehicles, but it's mostly just ground vehicle or ground combat, on foot combat. But the thing is that the camera is by far the worst enemy in this game, both on the ground and in vehicles. But I would say on the ground is probably the worst, because there'll be times that it wants to pull back to be able to show you a lot more of the enemies around you, which this game has the Arkham style of combat, Batman Arkham style. But because this isn't Batman, he's not bouncing around a lot more, so it's a lot slower of combat and a lot more methodical. Not bad, it's just not quite what the Arkham series has. But because the camera wants to pull back and show more, but often you're in an enclosed space, it'll get caught on a wall, and you'll end up fighting enemies that you can't see, or there'll be times that the auto-targeting may glitch out just a little bit and try to shoot someone that you can't see, or it just tries to focus on what you can see, even though you really want to shoot that one guy that's very dangerous, that just is off camera, that just stepped off camera. But because he's not on camera, the game thinks that you want to shoot the guy that is just, kind of, well, fodder. And the camera also has some issues where it wants to show all the pretty, gorgeous explosions, but during driving, which can lead to you wrapping yourself around just the wreckage of the wasteland. That said, when the game isn't being a little bit iffy with the camera, the game handles really well, and it is a very good podcasting game just because of how repetitive and how grindy it is. So I would say this is one that you could get in, play a few hours, get out, come back a little bit later. And the story isn't deep enough where you're going to really be missing a lot. And there's a lot of codex stuff. So if you want to read and keep up and find out more about the backstory, well, there you go. And Mad Max is $7.99 in the US. So how about a little bit of a deeper story with If My Heart Had Wings. This was actually a Game Club game on VGL. And it was good enough that I think I should include it here as well. It is probably one of the better entry-level or budget entry-level visual novels that you could get into. Even before a summer sale where the price just gets slashed big time. It is a very, very long visual novel. Well, I shouldn't say very, very long, because there are novels that absolutely dwarf this in length, but this isn't exactly a short budget level 3-4 hour story and that's it, and you've seen everything. This is probably about 20-ish hours, 20 to 30 I would say, really depending on your reading speed. And in the background it's just on autoplay, so this isn't nearly as quickly as you could go through it. And because of that, and the fact that it is so cheap, it is a good place to really jump into a more bigger budget visual novel scene. That said, there are issues with it, mostly with the translation. there is a couple clumsy translation issues with the Steam version. There is an English patch, a fan translation, which also restores some of the cut content, mostly the adult content. But it is also a bit of a pain to be able to install, so it is a little bit of a investment to be able to get going. It's not too difficult to get up and running. It's just it requires a little bit of tweaking around with the control panel, mostly to change your computer location because of how the fan translation, it goes off the original Japanese version, so it uses some of the syntax there. So it could cause some issues if you don't set that properly. It's not too difficult though. And I will also say that the story is very good. I've only done one of, I believe it's 5 different routes to completion, but I have looked at some of the other ones, and there's a lot of heartfelt moments. There's a lot of deep character moments, but it is also very slow in the base root story. So it does take a little bit to get going. But it is also $4.94 US dollars. So it is dirt cheap to be able to really try out a larger visual novel if you're interested in the genre and you've played a couple of the free ones and a couple of the budget Steam level ones. This is probably the best budget level Steam visual novel that you could get. And then, you start hitting more expensive ones like Clannad, which is, I believe it's still $60. And even with price cuts, it rarely drops to level below the 20 range. But this is one to really check out if you're interested in visual novels. So let's move swiftly along to something a little bit slower and more cerebral with Spintires. Off-roading. This is something that really isn't covered that much in gaming. Usually when you see an off-roading game, it has a huge focus on the racing aspect of off-roading. Something like Dirt, where it's off-road racing. This is off-roading, period. Well, it does have an objective. It is essentially a logging game, which may or may not sound fun, depending on how much you enjoy logging and the murder of trees. I'm kidding. But it does have an objective. It's not just, okay, here's a map and just wander around and do your own thing. There are objectives. There are things to do in this game. Mostly revolving around getting logs from point A to point B and the rather tough journey in between. And some of the maps are just brutal on difficulty. And that's even before you start getting into things like Iron Man mode, where all the trucks eat up a lot more fuel, and you can't just recover the trucks. You have to bring out another truck to try to dig it out of the mud, and that is really the crux of this game, is the off-roading aspect, and also just the simulation side of things. This is one of the rare simulation style games that I actually enjoy, and it has some amazing details when it comes to land information and how the dirt and the mud just squishes away from the tires. Even though it isn't exactly the most detailed of graphics, it does it really well, and you'll leave realistic ruts in the road, which can hamper you later in the game. That said, the level of detail could sometimes make it so that it's a little difficult to tell exactly where a road is going until you're already on top of the road. You may have seen that in the very beginning of the background footage, depending on just how I edit this. It's not a huge problem, but sometimes it's a little bit off-putting to just see the road kind of fade into existence, probably about 50 feet in front of you. But, it's limitations of the engine, I guess. And there are player-made maps. There's only a handful of maps in the game, but each one usually takes a couple of hours to beat. So, it is something that takes a while, and that's before you start really challenging yourself and trying to take on the achievements in this game, which are very difficult, by the way. And there are, like I said, there are player-made maps. They do exist, but they are a pain to get working correctly, and I've never actually been able to do it. Then again, I've never really sat down and tried to really focus on getting these working. It's just, I've enjoyed the stock maps well enough that I haven't really tried all that well. And speaking of annoying, another thing that is annoying, if this does have multiplayer, but there's no saving of the map in multiplayer. So if the host crashes, you lose all progress. And since there's no saving, you have to complete the map in one go, which, like I said, usually takes between an hour or two, maybe 3 if you're hitting a wall with some of the difficulty. Granted, multiplayer can make maps go a lot faster, depending on how well depending on just the skill of the drivers. That said, it still takes a while, and there's no save function. So there you go, and that is something to really keep in mind. And there's also in the past been issues with the developer and the publisher, which has caused the game to be broken. So be wary of that, and I would feel very remiss if I didn't mention this. Hopefully this isn't an issue in the future, but it's something to keep in mind because it has happened in the past. And, well, Spintires is $7.49 US. Alright, moving right along to Domina. This is the review copy on this list. Everything else has been paid by my own money. This is a review copy, though. And that said, I still really enjoyed this game. And it is very unique. You don't really see a lot of gladiator games either. Or at least the running of a gladiatorial pool, essentially. But it could also be a little obtuse because there's not a lot of refinement in this little subgenre. Mostly centering around the stats of the individual gladiators and how they balance off of one another. I'm sure if you sit down and figured it out, it's not that difficult, but as someone that's just played a few hours and enough to really enjoy this game, it's something that can be a little bit off-putting. And something else is that there are a lot of ways to play this game, but there's some that just seem to be vastly superior to others. Mostly centered around which employees you hire. I'm sure that there's other very viable combinations. And, well, the one I have in the background is not a very viable combination. It works, but not well. That said, it's something that really requires sitting down and tweaking and figuring out on your own. And it's also more of a chaos management game where there's not really a pause. There is, especially when you're looking at the gladiators' stats. But other than that, the game is always running. So you're always on the clock. And that can cause, if you're not sure what you want to do, to lose a lot of time. And because of how at least the base game, it has sort of a campaign mode, and then it has an endless mode, which is still experimental and is being developed. But in the base game, you have an overall campaign, an overall story where you have to do a certain thing within a time frame. And I don't want to spoil exactly what that is. But because of that, you have to be very careful about how you manage your time. In that, it can be a little bit frustrating at the first few times just to lose because you were too busy trying to read something and figure out what you were trying to do. And it also, at the very end of the game, and this is something I want to say, but I don't want to spoil, it has a very FTL-esque difficulty spike at the end of the story. And it can be very frustrating, and it also requires you to do something that doesn't make a lot of sense thematically, or at least when I played the game last. I haven't gone through after all the patching and gone to the end game again to just double check this, because it does take a couple hours. And when the game originally launched, there wasn't a save function, which caused a lot of issues, and it had a lot of bugs. It released in a very buggy state. It has seen a lot of post-launch work, but that said, it's still something that you may want to be careful of because there are still a few bugs in the game. As a matter of fact, I think I still have a little bit of a graphical glitch on the victory screen. It's not game-breaking. It's not that bad. It just could be a little bit annoying. And also, replay value really depends on just how well you want to try to go into the different styles of gameplay, because you can try to anger people to make the game a lot tougher on yourself, and you can ramp up the difficulty, but you're still essentially doing the same thing over and over again. So it really depends on just how well you want to do that. Anyway, this is $4.99, at least in North America. And speaking of North America, America's pastime. Well, I'm sure it's not this type of baseball, but Super Mega Baseball Extra Innings. This is one of the very few baseball games out there for PC, but it is also a very good baseball game. And that's something that you may not expect with the exaggerated art style, and it can be very off-putting to some people, but it does handle very well, and it has a very flexible difficulty setting, where it's not just one setting to change the overall gameplay. The difficulty can be adjusted per style, so you could make pitching a lot more difficult, or you could make batting a lot more difficult for yourself to find a balance and shore up weaknesses while also challenge your strengths, which is a very interesting way to handle the difficulty settings in this game. And on low difficulty, it offers a lot of assist and a lot of help, but it still requires you to be able to play the game. So it's a nice mixture of the two. And something else that is very interesting is that the mojo system in this game, which you may see pop up every so often as the computer battles itself, the mojo system allows for a more realistic streak of a hot player or a cold player in a particular game, where as the players do well, they gain mojo. And mojo is only effective whenever the player is in a high stress situation. So if there's no outs and no one on, and the team is up by 1,000,000 points, or 1,000,000 runs, sorry, it's runs, not points in baseball, remember that. If they're up by just a huge amount of runs, the mojo system doesn't kick in at all. But if the team is behind, but you have a player that's doing really well, they may perform a lot better under that stress. But the flip side is a player that's been struggling that game will also struggle even more when there's a high stress situation. That said, the game also runs very quickly. A 9-inning game only lasts, probably about 20-ish minutes, not very long. And that's partly just due to a lot of speeding up between the outs and making transitions a lot quicker than a simulation game does. And something else that feels a little odd to be able to say this is that there's female players in this game, which is something that is odd for a baseball game. You usually don't see that. It's something I normally wouldn't mention, but it's one of those things that it's an oddity, so I thought I'd throw that out there. Anyway, it is only $3.99, so if you enjoy sports games, you may want to give this one a shot. It may surprise you, even if you're not a huge fan of watching baseball. It is fun to play. And just have a little bit of a comedy as well, and it doesn't take itself too seriously, even though it is a very good baseball game. Alright, next up is Life is Strange. This was also a game club game on Video Game Logic, so if you want to have a huge breakdown and very spoilerific breakdown of this game, go listen to the VGL Game Club for Life is Strange. This was only actually a couple months ago, so it's a fairly recent one as well. But I will say right off the bat that this game is not for everyone. And it is very polarizing on just how much you could stand the writing of the game, because the game depicts teenagers very realistically. So there is a certain amount of cringe, there's a lot of dorky humor, but because it's realistic, if you're a bit younger or you could stand how teenagers talk, then it's not that big a deal. But if kids annoy the ever-living hell out of you, or, if someone's saying, hella something, then maybe you want to skip this. That said, the writing overall is pretty good. I did find that the game started a little bit on the sluggish side. It wasn't something that really got me going until towards the end of the first chapter. And this is the Double Fine-esque style of adventure game where it's broken up into 5 chapters. Even though all of them are out now, so you can treat this as just a completed story. And I also found that the 5th chapter was a little bit of a letdown, and the ending was a bit weak, at least personally for me. That said, that is a personal preference, and it may not apply to you. I also found that the art style was quite amazing, where everything had a very subdued color palette and very smooth. So it looked like it was all photographs, or I should say older style photographs, because the main character, Max, she takes a lot of Polaroid, so it reflects that very well. But that said, it has a lot of very impressive vistas. And supporting this is a great soundtrack, which you will hear a little bit of in the background. It has a lot of acoustic guitar, a lot of very thoughtful, punctuated music. And all the characters are very well fleshed out. Even the minor ones, I found a lot of well-rounded, well, I shouldn't even say well-rounded, but very deep characters. Even the ones that never really got their time in the spotlight, but were just, supporting characters the entire time. They were very well fleshed out. And since the story is complete, you don't have to worry about waiting for the next chapter. Everything is done. And there is a prequel of this coming out, not from Domina, the company that made Life is Strange. So that is something to be a little bit wary of, but they are also working on another game of Life is Strange. That said, there's not a lot of info on that either, so take Life is Strange as is. And if you want to try it out, the first chapter is available for a free demo. So if you're interested in it, well, there you go. Life is Strange, like I said, the first chapter is available for free to try out. But if you want to try the entire thing, it is $4.99, so it is dirt cheap to try out. Okay, wrapping up, our last one is Tomb Raider. This was a huge departure from the from the Tomb Raider series. It was essentially a reboot or a reimagining of the Tomb Raider franchise, which can be seen as both a strength and a weakness of this game, really depending on how you feel about the Tomb Raider series just in general. This one feels more like an action platformer than a puzzle game, and there's not a lot of tomb raiding, at least in this one. It may be in the next one. I haven't played it yet, and besides, it's not in the price range anyway, so it doesn't really matter now, does it? And I also will say that the beginning of the game is loaded with a lot of quick time events, which this does get toned down quite a bit after a little bit of a tonal shift towards, I would say, about the midpoint of the game. But it is something to keep in mind that if you're not a fan, this is a very, like I said, it's a polarizing game just because it is a reboot and a complete reimagining of the series, of a very well-known series. But because of that, it went into an audience that was more used to the Uncharted series, which you don't really even see that much on PC anyway, so there you go for that. And also, there's a lot of camera shake, which can cause some motion sickness in some people. And I mentioned a tonal shift. There's a very survival-esque aspect in the very beginning of the game, and it feels like that's going to last throughout the entire game, but it doesn't. I won't spoil just what happens, but it does shift from a game about just surviving on an island to something else, which can be a little bit off-putting if you're thinking a lot about it. If you're treating it as just an action adventure, then it's going to have a slow start. But if you're enjoying how the game feels in the beginning, it may put you off as well. Boy, this feels like such a rough recommendation, doesn't it? But I digress. Also, the game can be very, very, very gruesome at times, so be very wary about that. And that's just not the deaths that Laura can take, which is kind of a staple of the series, that Laura dies horribly very often. But also, just the set pieces in general can be very gruesome. So if you're a little bit squeamish, well, maybe something to skip. And also, I will say to skip the Game of the Year edition, because it is packed full of stuff for the very, very dead multiplayer. I think Stillborn would be the proper term for this, because I don't think anyone played the multiplayer, at least on PC. It may have been more of a console thing, to be perfectly honest, but there's a lot of DLC for the multiplayer, and there's a lot of pay-to-cheat and cosmetic stuff that doesn't really make a whole lot of difference. The only thing I can think of, that I can remember seeing out of the Game of the Year edition was one tune that was very, very ill-rated on its own. So I just don't think it's worth it. But that's just, like I said, it's a personal feeling, and it's only an extra $1. So if you want the Game of the Year edition, fine, it's $5.99. But the one I would recommend is just save the extra $1 and go for the $4.99 edition. And that wraps up the 10 for 10, or 10 games under 10, I guess I should say. Any games that I missed? Any that I should look at for the winter sale? Well, feel free to leave them in the comments below. And as always, constructive feedback is greatly appreciated, particularly on these videos that I really change the format of the Sunday Sampler and do something completely off the wall like this. And, well, if you don't really have anything to say or any games that you think should be on the list, well, just hit the appropriate buttons and subscribe if you were to see the Sunday Sampler return to its more traditional, just random indie games, and, well, or just my Let's Play content. As always, thank you for watching, and I will be back with something to sample next week. But until then, I'll see ya.